Inside Mbabazi's return, where a flag from the West requires the rigor of statecraft. Former Premier John Patrick Amama Mbabazi could return to the NRM fold 7 years after he was sacked for attempting to stage a palace coup against the incumbent President Museveni. To some observers, Mbabazi's exit at the height of a civil war within the inner sanctum of the party was prompted by his attempt to defy the unwritten rule to ascend the greasy pole without the president's blessing. But could the growing flag by Western powers in regard to the just concluded pause, peppered with violence, drive the urgency of his return? The pleasantries between President Museveni and his bush war comrade, John Patrick Amama Mbabazi, has been profound of late. Bruised and battered after the 2016 polls, where he came third and scored a dismal 1.4%, an unsuccessful challenge, the incumbent's victory in the Supreme Court, Mbabazi has been quietly attempting to repair ties with the president. In August 2018, Museveni, alongside First Lady Janet Museveni, attended the traditional marriage ceremony of Mbabazi's wife's niece, Bridget Birungi, to the son of South Africa's President, Cyril Ramaphosa. On January 22, 2020, Mbabazi met the president at his farm in Chisozi, Gomba district, and a fortnight later attended the Teresita celebrations at Nakaseke district, where he received a rousing welcome from senior army officers. However, it's his recent covert duties that show that he has a role to play in the post-2021 presidential poll.
When I wrote in the monitor that he is essentially used to be, or at least was, the operating system, I use the computer analogy, or the operating system, the iOS, the Android of the NRM. So when the elections took place and Mbabazi is beaten, he comes out with less than 2% of the vote. Many people's thoughts were there. You were predicting he was much bigger than he really was. So if the movements right now underway are anything to go by, then it does seem that he, after all, still remains a figure to reckon with. But we saw some of this over the last few years.
Highly placed sources reveal that on October 1, 2020, President Yoweri Museveni summoned Uganda security chiefs for a meeting at State House Entebbe to discuss the security situation in the country. The surprise guest at the meeting was Mbabazi. Amongst the sticky issues at the meeting was the practice of ISO to detain suspects in safe houses, which the president argued was an outdated practice that ought to stop. Mbabazi reportedly told the meeting that safe houses are staying on the national conscience and continue to dent the image of the regime. As a vote of confidence, Museveni then appointed Mbabazi's acolyte and former aide-de-camp, Major Emi Katabazi, to the coveted position of Second Deputy Director General, Internal Security Organization, ISO. Katabazi was in November 2015 charged with absence without leave and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, contrary to Section 14812A, 17812, and 5A of the Uganda People's Defense Forces (UPDF) Act. He was set free in 2016 after spending 7 months in detention at Makindye Military Barracks. But during the handover, the Security Minister, General Eli Tumwine, refused to acknowledge the appointment of Major Katabazi. This prompted the president to send a radio message to all army units confirming Katabazi's appointment. As some of his protégés continue to return to influential positions, Mbabazi will discover that a lot has changed if he accepts to work with his bourgeois comrade.
Showed us that he's sort of gone out of the public limelight in the formal sense, but he remains more like what a Charles Njonjo was in Kenya. The people who are not in office, but nothing gets done without speaking to them.
Charles Njonjo, who is now 101 years of age, is the former powerful Attorney General and Constitutional Affairs Minister under the Jomo Kenyatta and Daniel Arap Moi governments. He steered Kenya through its difficult transition after Kenyatta's death in 1978 and helped ensure Daniel Arap Moi's accession to the presidency after some politicians in central Kenya rejected him. So what could be the driving force behind the return of Mbabazi?
States and bureaucracy is put under pressure, especially in the context of an electoral outcome, there is usually a situation that brings in that emptiness, and that emptiness in itself breeds a feeling of response. And now the response in this case could be on the extreme side, it could be mild, or sometimes it could be a do nothing. But usually states do not want to be seen to do nothing. And in order for states to be seen to be in control, for the bureaucracy to be seen in control, they usually make responses that sometimes do shade a picture of fear, a picture of being in charge, and a picture of being in control.
According to Ntale, if Mbabazi is to return to the fold, he comes to reinforce the fault lines.
Over an electoral cycle, that team is expected. What again, of course, is not known. How is the team going to look like? What is emergingly obvious is that Amama is likely to be a part of the team. And like I've held before, Amama's role prior to the election perhaps was to study the electoral process, study the outcome, or anticipate the outcome, and work on dealing with the outcome in order to progress after the outcome.
An exponent of statecraft, Mbabazi returns at the time the president's halo continues to diminish in the West.
Situation where the leadership might see that there could be situations that are making us commit mistakes or commit actions that may cast us in a bad way, then we need to think about an angle, or we need to think about a strategy that can help us, one as a leadership and as a bureaucracy in charge, to do some repair or do some damage control. And in repairing some damage control means employing skillscraft and employing persona that is perceived to help in doing that job.
Mbabazi has, according to sources, met a number of envoys from the West recently to repair cracks emerging in ties between Uganda and its erstwhile allies. The United States government on Tuesday called for independent, credible, impartial and thorough investigations into alleged irregularities in Uganda's presidential elections. Washington also wants members of state security services probed for alleged abuses against opposition candidates and civil society. On February 11th, the European Parliament adopted a resolution deploring the January 14th elections, which they called neither democratic nor transparent. They condemned the excessive use of force by the police and armed forces during the election and their growing interference in political affairs. The condemnation comes at the height of kidnaps of youths who are largely supporters of presidential candidate Robert Kyagulanyi, who scored 35.8% of the vote and came second in the polls. In response, the president, while meeting EU envoys led by their head of delegation, Ambassador Attilio Pacifici, implored the West to respect the sovereignty of African governments. By involving yourself in matters that you do not understand, even if you do understand, you should not get involved, because this kind of misconduct can lead to many serious consequences and suffering of people, like it happened in some African countries, Museveni said. With the Libyan experience and its attendant problems after the NATO-led annihilation of Muammar Gaddafi still fresh in the memories of diplomats, the West has adopted a cautious approach in dealing with regime changes across Africa. The Western powers have been notoriously fickle towards their approach with Uganda, where the incumbent has for large spells been the point man in the volatile Great Lakes region and Horn of Africa enclave. On December 7, 2020, President Museveni met a delegation of US and UK envoys who sought his opinion over the South Sudan conflict. However, the voices of criticism from Western capitals were amplified shortly after the January 14, 2021 election. In turn, the Kampala regime has adopted countervailing measures seeking alliances with the Eastern Bloc of countries such as China, Russia, as a repudiation of the neo-colonial agenda pursued by Western powers.
The role number one being that the West should be informed that you are no longer the only block of alliances. We can also make alliances from elsewhere.
To observers, the Western appears to be conflicted with how to deal with the Kampala government, which remains vital to its interests in the Great Lakes and Horn of Africa.
The West was largely sort of indifferent. One or two statements of concern about the situation, consulting people in the media and the political class and lawyers, but basically it was just seen as an internal matter. I don't know if it was the arrest in December last year of the human rights lawyer Nicholas Opio that suddenly and briefly removed Bobby Wine from the front and center of Western interest to Nicholas Opio, obviously because of the pet subject gays in Uganda, and he's been kind of a vocal human rights advocate for the safety and welfare and dignity of the gay community in Uganda. But then in one voice, the Western embassies rise up, condemn it, they appear in court taking notes, and in other words, we go back to when certain vital Western interests are touched, pressure from within the embassies here and their countries and parliaments abroad.
But Karyejira says the two peaks of Museveni's friendship with the West are in the past.
The fallout from the Rwanda change of power, the genocide in 1994, and the installation of the RPF in power in Rwanda sort of became one of the peaks of President Museveni's use to the West. The RPF was really an offshoot of the NRA in Uganda, and when 2 years later the combined forces of Uganda and Rwanda invaded Zaire and removed the long-standing President Mobutu Sese Seko, suddenly in this Eastern Africa and to Central Africa, Great Lakes region area, this president who had helped create the change of regime in Rwanda and now Congo was seen as more like the kingmaker of the region. The second peak comes a decade later after the Union of Islamic Courts in Somalia take power in December of 2006, and suddenly the West has a crisis. What do you do with an hardline Islamic government in power in Mogadishu? And then Uganda, in defying parliamentary opinion, goes past the legislature and sends troops to Somalia. Remember, when the fighting had just begun in Ethiopia, a government delegation came to see President Museveni here and hoping to use his, I guess, good offices and reputation in the region to kind of help smooth over the tensions, but it achieved nothing.
But as Ethiopia, a major ally of the West in the Horn of Africa, convulses in this conflict, whose end is not in sight, the West could remain fixated with Museveni as their consistent ally in the Horn of Africa against a stubborn enemy, the Al-Shabaab. The view amongst foreign policy wonks is that Kenya, which could fill the void, must navigate the 2022 polls, first pitting an alliance crafted around the dynastic families of Uhuru Kenyatta, Raila Odinga and Gideon Moi against William Ruto. But Karyejira says with the just concluded polls where the president had his lowest score of 58% and lost in the central region, which is the heartbeat of the country, the writing is on the wall.
You might say as a stopgap measure, you reluctantly bring back somebody who's acceptable to the NRM, Amama Mbabazi, and as I said earlier, you saw his reception at NRM events. Bring him back to, one, deal with the crisis we're facing right now within the NRM, and then helps hold the NRM together. And I guess if he's acceptable to the West, which many people think he is, he becomes that figure, the Daniel Arap Moi, the Thabo Mbeki.
Karyejira says Mbabazi must reach out to the West and should try to craft a bipartisan agenda which is woven into transitional agenda. But what is the pragmatism of such a transitional government? Chise Kantale, a political science scholar, says if Mbabazi were to return to government, he should pursue a bipartisan agenda, with Kyagulanyi scoring 35.8% and the opposition doyen Kizza Besigye, who scored 37% and 35.4% in the 2006 and 2016 polls respectively. A transition could be incomplete without these two leaders.
Increasingly, when we talk about opposition politics coming, it comes as an activist kind of politics. Now, this has got its advantages, it also has got its disadvantages. The advantage there is that the activist politics tries to give some kind of pressure. And it tries to give some kind of force and desire for transformations in a particular way. The challenge that it does bring is it brings a progressive rigidity.
He says opposition politicians who may embrace the transition could be treated with suspicion by their supporters.
We move the country forward, and in that there gives, there takes. However, because our politics has been molded on an activist kind of foundation, those in the opposition really become so vulnerable when they begin to talk in a bipartisan kind of framework. Why? Because our politics has been constructed on extremes.